10-year-old Jenny and her sister Sarah have seen their mother for the last time. Sold for 100 British pounds, they belong to a distant relative of America's first president. They are Washingtons now, on a 3-month journey to their new home on our young country's western frontier, the state of Tennessee. With a life of servitude ahead of her, Jenny will watch her children and grandchildren labor to build one of the wealthiest plantations in the United States. Though Sarah will die a slave, Jenny will spend the last few years of her life as a free woman. But the blood required to end her bondage and that of millions like her will not be shed for another 60 years.
When I was a small boy, 5 or 6 years old, every Sunday just about after church, my maternal grandfather would take me for a ride out in the country. And often we would pass the entrance gate to Wessington, and my grandfather would slow down or stop and say, "That's Washington. That's where your grandmother's family came from."
Beginning with Jenny's long walk from Virginia, generations of John Baker's family spent their lives here, working the rich Robertson County soil, not because it was home, and not by choice. While just a child himself, John would answer the call to tell their stories. What would become his life's work began with the discovery of an old photograph in a middle school textbook.
When I was in the 7th grade, we used a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee, and I spotted a photograph of 4 individuals who had formerly been enslaved. And for some reason, I seemed drawn to this photograph, and I looked at it each time I would go to class thinking they resembled individuals that I'd seen before. And I learned later from my grandmother that 2 of them were her grandparents, Emmanuel and Henny Washington, who had been enslaved at Wessington Plantation. So I was immediately fascinated right then. I couldn't wait to get back to school to tell my classmates that my great-great-grandfather and mother's picture was in our social studies textbook. Some of them believed me, some didn't. So it dawned on me what my grandfather really meant, that my family's history went back there some 200 years.
John was determined to learn all he could about his ancestors. When a relative told him that descendants of the original owners still lived at Wessington, he contacted the family. John discovered that just a few years earlier, the plantation records had been donated to the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, which was soon to become his home away from home. Teenage curiosity soon turned into obsession. John would spend the next 30 years combing through thousands of documents and photographs and interviewing dozens of descendants, culminating in his book, The Washingtons of Wessington Plantation.
During slavery, most plantation owners would have had to have kept these type of records. It's just that few of them survived. And Wessington happens to be one of the most documented in the South, I would say.
Wessington Plantation's very distinctive. Not only was it one of the largest in Tennessee, all the records survived. So unlike a lot of plantations that we look at, we can give a fairly full picture of what slavery was like.
That later generations kept all of those documents is truly remarkable. But what I also think is important is that the oral traditions of the enslaved members of the Wessington Plantation were preserved as well.
I was very fortunate. When I started my research, there were probably 20 to 25 individuals who were children or grandchildren of former Wessington slaves. So after I started interviewing some of these people, I became as interested in their family histories as I was my own. So that's how I ended up spending 30 years of research. Some people say, you mean it takes 30 years to trace your ancestry? And I said, no, it takes 30 years to trace 300 people's ancestry.
300 people. 300 human beings. During Wessington's heyday as the largest tobacco plantation in America, nearly 300 African Americans were forced under constant threat of brutal punishment or separation from loved ones through sale to keep the lucrative operation going.